Welcome. I hope by now that you've gotten the basics of the constructionist approach to social problems. In a word, it's all about definitions. As we move forward to talk about other components of the social problems process, I think you'll see that most of it traces back to this issue of definitions. Who puts them forward? How are they put forward? And what happens to them? In this chapter, we begin a focus on the who. Best describes two kinds of claims makers, insiders and outsiders. Insider claims makers have positions inside the agencies of government, and they're the ones with the power to institute policies that address the conditions they take up. I noticed that a number of you in writing your blog posts discussed how these insiders took up the claim that you're focused on. Best covers insiders in more detail in Chapter 4. In Chapter 3, he's concerned with outsider claims makers. These are people that most frequently come to mind when we think about claims about social conditions. They're the activists who are usually the ones to first identify a condition and then define it as something that's troubling. They're the Candace Lightners who founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the Lois Gibbses who founded the movement to address toxic waste pollution, maybe the Thomas Osborns who started an organization dedicated to helping people who are incarcerated here in New York State. If agencies of the government begin to take an interest in a condition, it's almost always because of pressure from outsiders like these. So as the chapter points out, it takes more than a single individual identifying a problem to put forward a social problems claim that will be taken seriously. It takes a whole organization of some kind, and that's the subject of this chapter. Best makes an important distinction between a social movement and a social movement organization. In this class, you've mostly been working with social movement organizations, or SMOs. A social movement usually consists of many social movement organizations. Think of the civil rights movement. Makes a great case in point. It consists of groups like the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the organization behind the Black Lives Matter movement. The environmental movement provides another good example. It consists of many different SMOs, including mainstream groups like Environmental Defense Fund, Resources for the Future, the Nature Conservancies, groups like that, which seek to work within the existing system of laws and economic relationships. The environmental movement also includes groups, though, like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and Earth First, all of which seek much wider social change and use protest and direct action to put forward their claims. I think that nearly everyone in the class is examining a social problem that has at least 2 or 3 organizations behind it. I don't think, however, that anyone is working on a topic that's supported by a whole large social movement on the scale of the civil rights or the environmental movement. Okay, so let's begin with some vocabulary. Sociologists studying social movements use a slightly different set of terms than those studying social problems. In the place of grounds, they talk about diagnostic frames. Like grounds, diagnostic frames identify the nature of a problem. In place of warrants, they use the term motivational frame. A motivational frame explains why action is needed to address a condition. Prognostic frames specify what needs to be done to alleviate the problem. In order to address a problematic condition, though, social movement organizations have to mobilize resources such as money, time, staff, and expertise in a wide range of specialties, including things like general management, volunteer management, media relations, policy making, lobbying, and of course, a very big one these days, fundraising. Organizations that provide a service of some kind, I'm talking here about groups that offer hotlines or shelters, training, that sort of thing, they not only have to develop expertise in all the things I just mentioned, but also in their service area as well. But regardless of the problem that they seek to address, SMO's ability to lobby and fundraising is at least in part based on the degree to which they can motivate support from the public at large. And this is where this language of framing comes into play. Claims-making organizations need to align their frames with existing frames that are relevant to the audiences that they seek to motivate. The thing is here, though, is that the activists who identify conditions and name them as problems often have frames that are different than the people that they seek to motivate. I'll give you an example of this in just a couple of minutes. But they've seen the problem and likely have had personal experience with it. Take Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for example. Again, Candace Lightner had just lost her 13-year-old daughter to a drunk driver who had just been released after another drunk driving incident. In fact, he'd been convicted of drunk driving 3 or 4 times in the previous few years. After each incident, his driver's license was reinstated. This was 1980. At that time, drunk driving was not taken seriously. This will sound, I think, a little weird to you, but drunk driving was kind of a joke. It operated within a frame that defined killing someone while driving under the influence as less serious than possessing even a small quantity of marijuana. A frame, another way to think about a frame is to think of a taken for granted way of viewing everyday life. So let's get back to Candace Lightner. When the police told her that the driver who had just killed her daughter would receive little punishment, she was outraged. I don't know if I've seen a sociologist describe it this way, but in essence, her frame cracked. What had been a normal and accepted way of viewing drunk driving was suddenly not normal to her. In order to bring about change, Lightner had to shift other people's frames. She had to change their definitions. Does that sound familiar? Well, it's exactly what the constructionist approach is all about. Again, definitions. One of the things that best addresses in the chapter is how claimsmakers bring about change in people's frames. He talks about 4 different strategies. The first is frame bridging. Here, in frame bridging, activists seek support from people who already have frames that are similar to their own, but not exactly aligned with the issue that they're currently concerned with. So, for example, claimsmakers might direct a message about transgender rights to those who are sympathetic with the cause of gay rights. In a sense, what are they doing here? They're building a bridge from one concern to another concern. The second strategy is frame amplification. In frame amplification, claimsmakers draw on values that they believe people already hold and show how the condition that they're concerned with will impact those values. Their appeal is typically a very emotionally charged one. The third strategy, it's a little bit harder to understand, is called frame extension. In frame extension, activists seek to enlarge their own frame so that they include frames that they hope are accepted by the audiences that they seek to influence. Economic efficiency and health frames here are good examples. Think about an activist concerned with something like tropical deforestation, for example. He or she is likely to be concerned about deforestation for its own sake. He or she views the rainforest most likely as a place of beauty, a place of wonder. But this isn't necessarily a frame shared by the general public. In frame extension, what our activist does is put aside his or her frame about the intrinsic value of the rainforest and instead talks about the value of the products that the rainforest produces. In the case of arguments about biodiversity, this is exactly what happened. Activists started talking about the potential for the development of new pharmaceutical products based on the unique plants and animals found in the tropical jungle. Okay, the fourth strategy is frame transformation. Here, activists seek to persuade audiences to reject their taken-for-granted worldview and adopt a different frame. Frame transformation was exactly what Candace Lightner had to do in order for her to get out her message about drunk driving. In an interview, it's interesting, an interview with People magazine, she was quoted as saying, "If my daughter had been raped or murdered, no one would excuse the killer. Death caused by a drunk driver, however, is the only acceptable form of homicide." Well, a statement like that represents a great example of an attempt at frame transformation, doesn't it? It basically says, this thing, drunk driving, that you thought was kind of a joke, is actually homicide. Again, what are we looking at? How something is defined. I want to pause for a minute and talk about something that frankly scares the heck out of me, and that's some people's resistance to frame transformation around COVID. I'm talking here about people who are resistant to the COVID vaccine. Now, clearly, there are people who are hesitant about getting their children the standard childhood vaccinations. I think they're nuts, but I can kind of understand that the dangers of polio, diphtheria, measles, etc. are remote to many people, precisely, by the way, because of the success of childhood vaccines, but let's put that aside. So on some level, these people see the vaccines as representing a greater threat than the childhood diseases. Okay. COVID, though, is totally different, completely different. People all around the vaccine refusers are dying. It's not an abstraction. People who've never been vaccinated are not dying. People who have been vaccinated, rather, are not dying. You don't need to believe the medical establishment here. It's right in front of people's eyes. Yet existing frames about personal freedom or evil pharmaceutical companies, etc., these frames remain. And this is to say nothing, by the way, about the bogus treatments for COVID once you get it, such as ivermectin, camel urine actually is a cure. I think it was reported in Egypt or Syria as a cure for COVID. Ash from a particular volcano in the Philippines, bleach, the list goes on. If we're at a point where people decide to hold on to a frame that is literally killing them, then I think we're back in the dark ages when exorcism was a valid method for treating certain medical problems. All right, I'm going to leave it there for now, but just let me mention that the material that BEST offers on opportunity structures is also something that you should pay close attention to. It's definitely the case that activists need to place their frames, It's definitely the case that activists need to place their claims within compelling frames. Without these frames, success is pretty close to impossible. Opportunity structures, however, can catapult claims to a whole different level. There's no better example of this, actually, than the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter organization began in 2013 following the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the man responsible for the Stand Your Ground killing of Trayvon Martin. The movement grew over the next few years, but it was only after the killing of George Floyd in 2020 that the term Black Lives Matter entered the mainstream. Floyd's murder, as tragic as it was, represented an opportunity that movement leaders were able to exploit to bring about a profound frame transformation. This transformation, by the way, is having and will likely continue to have long-term impacts. Now, I want to underscore here that Floyd's killing was most certainly a vile and racist act. But from the standpoint of the Black Lives Matter movement, it also presented an opportunity to get out an important message about police maltreatment of members of the African American community. The word opportunity here, I think, is what causes people to pause at what I'm trying to explain. The word has positive connotations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the event bringing about the opportunity is itself a positive one. While it's definitely the case that claimsmakers often take advantage of tragedy, I'm sure that few of them hope that tragic events actually occur. So please, regarding opportunity structures, please pay close attention to what BEST has to say and imagine how they may have in the past influenced the progress of the claim that you're following, or maybe think about the kinds of opportunities that might arise down the road to catapult your frame forward. To catapult your problem forward. Okay, just one last thing. There won't be a blog post assignment for this week, though I will post a quiz on the chapter later in the week. Okay, I hope that you found this helpful.